as in now.
Yes.
Greetings to everyone watching. Greetings to the participants in the Zoom platform. We greet everyone in the wonderful name of Jesus Christ. Nonke bazalwane around South Africa and abroad. Siyanibulisa in the wonderful name of Jesus Christ. Amen. In the second week of our engagements and our shows, we have another interesting topic today, presented by our guest, which I'm going to introduce after we opened Ngomthandazo. We have a topic ETI today, factors influencing South African basic education, impacts, outcomes. Excuse that. Before we carry on, I'd like to apologize for my my sound. Apparently, so I'd like to apologize for that, hoping that at least you can hear a thing or two. Before we go any further, I'd like to ask Brother Shoneli Kaya class to open with prayer before I introduce our guest, and then we head on to the topic. But Shoneli Kaya, Moloput. All right. Seems like Uputlanel Kaya has left. Talasi Valena Mesho, so that we open in prayer. Ekamini lo ise, ekamini lo nyana, ekamini lo moyo ngcwele. Ubunguthixo izolo, nguThixo namhlanje. Sithemba ubuzoba nguThixo nangomso. Bawona amandla onke, as we start this show or this program, Lord Almighty, we'd like to invite you, Father God. And while we invite you, siyakubulela somandla, that we got the opportunity to be able to listen to whatever that is going to be presented to us. And Thixo namandla onke siyakucela sonina nina usivule indlebe bawona amandla onke ukuze Nkosi sibe nako ukuva bawona amandla onke, and also prepare our minds Thixo namandla onke ukuze zikwazi ukugcina konke sikufundisiweyo. And Lord Almighty, enable us ukuze, Father God, if there's a need of implementation in whatever that we're going to learn now, Thixo namandla onke sikwazi ukuyi-implement okanye ukwazi ukuyi-practice. Thixo namandla onke, may all the things esizozifundiswa okanye things that are going to be presented to us zingaweli phansi. Thixo namandla onke, yanga Thixo namandla zingaweli umhlabeni ochumayo. Thixo namandla onke ukuze Nkosi namandla i-presentation ka-Isa Thixo namandla onke ingahambi nje bawona amandla onke in her effort. Lord Almighty, bless everyone who's watching, Lord Almighty, and the engagements moya ngcwele yanga Thixo zingaba zezi product Thixo namandla onke zisisele endaweni. Thixo namandla onke sithetha ke Nkosi zikhalimela zonke distractions in the wonderful name of Jesus Christ. Amen. Amen. Okay. Viewers at home, we have our lady, a good cake. Before, when we were getting to know her, someone said, "Oh, good doctor," and she said, "No, I received, but I'm giving you doctor." But okay, we pray, we hope and pray that soon she'll be a doctor. Isasiphinkosi Mdingi. Usisi Isasiphinkosi Mdingi holds a law degree, yase-40, which attained in 2017. And ngaphezu koko, she did not stop ukufunda. She went on to study, to get her master's in public administration, in education, economy, and management from University of Science and Technology, Beijing, China, in 2020. The lady we're talking about is a very young lady from the Eastern Cape, a rural girl, who who's from a privileged background, or benemali ezinkulu to go abroad. No, she's like many of us, and even maybe and also got from a more disadvantaged background than most of us, but she pushed until she got what she wanted. She has what her ancestors dreamt of. Isasiphinkosi, Sisi. Hello.
Hi.
Njani? I'm very well, thank you. Please, just before you start on with your presentation, I'm sure most people are interested, but why China?
Well,
why
get China based on its education system? They've got a strong education system, which has influenced rapidly their economic development. So that was my interest, and also because China developed itself in over 30 years period, and you look at South Africa, that we are over 27 years now. That was before China had almost a similar background with South Africa in terms of the economic status. So looking at that was interesting to me. Also, there was the involvement of women and how educated they are and how active they are in the economic system. And you would know that I'm also very much an advocate of gender justice. So those are the two things to me: the involvement of women in the education, in the economy, and also the education system of China.
I saw when we were trying to get to know you, you mentioned the fact that you specialize in, what exactly do you specialize in, and could you just share
my master's background
your research interest?
So the line is a bit bad. My background in my master's is in systems. So I look a lot on systems, and that's where my interest is based mostly. When I talk of system, I mostly focus on administration, how schools are administered, and also the funding part. As you can see, my master's in education, economy, and management. So it's based on the financial side of financing schools, but also on the part of administration, how they are administered, because they truly are intertwined. If there's a bad administration, it affects the financial side. But if there's shortage of finances, it affects the administration side.
Oh, all right. Before I ask you to get started with your presentation, I'd like to ask Oratile,
okay,
please mute your mic. The sound is a bit disturbing. Okay, sis Isa, over to you, my darling. Let's not waste your time. Please do present to us. But to the viewers at home, please do feel free to just type your comments and questions in the comment section. And when the time comes, I'll just read them to Isa, to Sis Isa, when the time is right, when she's done with her presentation. It'll be time for questions and answers. Over to you, Sis Isa.
All right. Greetings to everyone, listeners at home, and everyone who took their time to come and listen to me. I also want to extend a thank you and a gratitude to the Wesley Guild SA for giving me this opportunity. Because most of the time our researchers are collecting dust in our universities and they're stuck in internet without anyone ever reading them. So to be given an opportunity to share my findings and what I learned throughout my research process in one of the areas that are very important in South Africa, which is the education sector, becomes very important to me at this point in time. Sorry about the noise, it's my neighbor. So today I'm going to be unpacking my research topic, which is factors influencing South African basic education outcomes. And how I chose this topic was based on my own experiences as a child who grew up in a rural community, and with the harsh realities of a society where there was no transportation, there was no water, sanitation, and we were learning in mud schools. Please give me just a second. Okay, yeah, I can hear. Can you guys hear me now? Okay, it's done now.
We can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, so this study explores two provinces, the Eastern Cape and Gauteng province. And the reason why I chose these two provinces because these two provinces shape the economy and everything when it comes to South Africa. You would remember, or you'll take back to history, that in the 1800s, when Gauteng was to be an economic hub of what was then Union of South Africa, it was men who were taken from the Eastern Cape. So Eastern Cape was the labor hub of what was rebuilt as an economic state in Gauteng. So men were moved from the Eastern Cape to work in the mines. As a result, the development of Gauteng happened in the expanse of the Eastern Cape, which led to the Eastern Cape and the development. So on this research, I looked at that from firstly on that point of view, and post-colonial era, what then influences some of the differences. We're 27 years into democracy, and when I was doing my research and concluding it, we're 26 years into democracy. But in the main, what I found out was that Eastern Cape schools are characterized by inadequate infrastructure in schools. Most are still having mud schools. There's still no running water in schools. They're still dependent on tanks. There are no toilets in some schools, so pin latrines are what are being used. There's no connectivity to have internet, and there's teacher shortage. But if you look on the contrary to Gauteng, Gauteng as a province has a lot of privileges. They have a lot of access also to financial investment in terms of when companies want to donate. You look at just an example when we're having Christmas Fall, a lot of celebrities and companies raise money and donate it to Wits University, which was already an established university. And we continue to have WUSU, University of Forte, being in the same position as it was when we started the movement. So those are the disparities I discovered, and that were also the basis of that create the differences between the two provinces. And those two provinces are standing on the opposite side, but they also represent different parts of the country, because Eastern Cape looks similar to KwaZulu-Natal, Limpopo, and you find your Gauteng in Western Cape and Free State on the other side, simply because these are economic hubs, the other ones are the former homelands. And in that aspect, then it creates the differentiation in terms of the results. And the current South African education still reflects the class privileges of the past, where geographical location of the school determines a lot of what's going to be the outcome. If you are located in Gauteng, there's higher chance that you will succeed in terms of school. But if you are located in the Eastern Cape, there's lesser chance of you being successful post-high school. Yes, you can reach to matric and pass, but being successful beyond that, it's a whole another aspect. Because of the quality of education that is offered and the resources that learners in this part of the Eastern Cape are receiving. And because of these different dynamics, there are certain aspects to it that leads to the differentiation, the school administration, the funding model. The funding model and school administration are two pillars that are holding the education system together. And as I mentioned, they're intertwined into what translates into education outcomes. But before I get to explain those two and how they trickle down to everything, I want to go through certain words that I'll use mostly and some people might not really be acquainted with when it comes to the education sector. So firstly, schools in South Africa are characterized in terms of quintiles, or they are classified in terms of quintiles. So there's quintile 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Quintile 1, 2, 3 are your schools that are in township and rural areas. They are categorized as poor schools. And then you have your quintile 4 to 5 schools, which is your least poor schools, which is they're mostly in urban settings. And those schools are what they call fee-paying schools. And the quintile 1 to 3 schools are what you call no-fee schools, which is they are mainly dependent on government for every funding. And then the quintile 4 to 5 schools, as they are categorized as fee-paying schools, they are receiving funding through school fees at a school, and they're also still receiving subsidy from government for their administration, the running of school, and they're still getting teachers paid by the government. So all teachers in public schools are paid by government. But then when it comes to quintile 4 to 5 schools, they still have fees that they pay students that pay for the running of the school. But also just to track on history, most of quintile 4 to 5 schools were former private schools pre-1994. And in 1990, when the country decided that they were now going to a democratic country, they then gave a choice to these schools whether they want to remain a private school or a public school. And most of those schools moved to being public schools. And when they moved to being public schools, they already had a good infrastructure in terms of buildings, in terms of sanitation, in terms of running water, and many other things that are needed to run a proper school and have good results. So there were already those differences. And then on your quintile 1 to 3 schools, you'll then also remember that education was only catered for a minority of people in South Africa. So these schools had no good infrastructure. They were mud schools, and some were still learning outside under the trees. So post-1994, when the government decided to have what they call a uniform system, which is through the South African School Act, every school was to abide by the rules and all that was happening in the country. There were these differences. There were these inequalities between those two spheres of the country, or rather, these two geographical locations, the Union of South Africa and the former homelands. So in that aspect, then, you then have schools being also classified based on whether they are Section 20 school or Section 21 school. Section 20 school are your quintile 1, 2, 3 school, and the Section 21 school are your quintile 4 to 5 schools. The difference between the two is what I'm going to explain on my chapter 3, which is on my chapter 3 of the research, as to what's the difference between a Section 20 school and a Section 21 school. With that being said, you then have these differences between these two schools, all surviving in this one system. One national minister of education, one MEC in one province, and you go down. You have your district people, while they're different schools under it. Some are in quintile 4, some are in quintile 1, 2, 3. So my then question was then, what creates the differences? We have a uniform system that is meant to cater for every child. And South Africa prided itself for universalizing the education system post-1994, making sure that every child goes to school. But if we look at the results and the demographics even of university, when it comes to university enrollments and who goes out of university after that, there's so much differences between Black, white, Indians. And that is also caused by the kind of education system that we have in our primary education. And in that aspect, Eastern Cape province, or rather your former homelands provinces, are affected the most. So as I said, that was my introduction of what the education system looks like. Now, post-1994, the government decided to unify the education system. And then in that, it also decided to change the administration structure of the education system from a differentiated education system that existed under the different districts that were there, or under the different education administration, because the different former homelands had their own administration. The Union of South Africa had their own education administration system. The government then decided to have a school-based system. So the school-based system practically means that the administrations of school will be solely lying to the school. So they then created your school governing body, where parents, teachers, learners, and other non-educator personnel also form part of the SGB. But what was interesting and what was different this time was that parents were now having more power. So parents need to have a 50+1 majority in the school governing body. And then you then have your teachers and your learners, but parents have the majority. But pre-1994, principals had the power towards the schools. Now, with school governing bodies, with parents taking the majority, it meant that parents were the decision power. It no longer relied mostly on the principals, and it needed a collaboration of the principal, the parents, and the teachers, which is it created a lot of bone of contention, because principals are used to having the power to use to themselves, but now they have to share their power with the parents. And in most of the time, what then happens in quintile 1 to 3 schools is that most of the parents that are elected to the school governing body are illiterate. When I was doing my research, I found out that we have about 2 districts in the Eastern Cape that fall in the top 5 of the most illiterate people in the country. So with that in mind, you have parents, you got to have a parent who's the chairperson, you have a parent who's the secretary, and the parent who's the treasurer. And these people are supposed to run the finances, and they have to decide on the curriculum of the school. They have to decide on the budgetary structure of the school. They have to fundraise, and all these other aspects. Now, this poses a challenge because this is a rural community with people who are illiterate, who are unable to participate properly, even in the discussions of what is happening in a meeting. So while they have the power in terms of paper, the principals are still running the show. They're still the ones who are deciding what happens. And most of the time they decide with the school management team, which is the SMT, which is the formation of teachers. But if you look on the other side of the spectrum, if you look at your Gauteng, now province, you have on your Gauteng province, majority of the school in quintile 4 to 5, and the parents in quintile 4 to 5 are your middle class people. That they fall in that category, and some of the working class, which is the teachers and teachers, police, and the rest. Now, these are people who are able to read the policies, they're able to engage with the principal. So when there's a meeting, the chairperson of the SGB is probably a CEO of a small company, or is probably an executive member of some company, or is working somewhere where they're able to have access to enough information. And because parents are paying money for their children, they expect a certain accountability from principals and the school at large in terms of their results, in terms of the service they provide for their kids. So these are also, again, the differences of what was brought by a school-based management system, where the government was saying, we want people who are closer to the school to take the decision. that worked in favor of schools in quintile 4 to 5, but at a disadvantage of schools in quintile 1, 2, and 3, because parents still cannot have much say. As a result, at one point, I was dealing with one school whereby the principal wanted parents to pay for nutrition fee for kids who were repeating a grade, which is illegal. But the parents did not know that. And the principal had simply said that that's what the district policy said. So when I got there and attended the meeting and said, please give me the policy, there was no policy. As a result, that decision had to be reversed. But many of us cannot be in these meetings because we live in urban areas. Then our parents become victims of these acts by those different principals in terms of the decision making, because it still lies on them. And also the other disadvantage has been that when it comes to rural schools, there's been a lot of cases of fraud and mismanagement of money, because the principal or one of the members in the SMT would decide what will happen, and the parent will sign a check. Sometimes we've heard of cases where the check is signed blank, and then they fill in the amount of money, simply because the person who's dealing with that, the treasurer of the school, which is in the SGB, has no formal education at all. They cannot do audits, they cannot draft budget, they cannot be involved in any way. They are just an SGB because they're supposed to be an SGB, and an SGB is supposed to be a parent. So those are the differences when it comes to what was brought by the school-based management system when it was introduced into South Africa. Now, on the other side of the decision-making, when post-apartheid, the government decided to then use equitable share as a way to finance public institutions. Now, in equitable share, it's where government decides Eastern Cape you're receiving 20 million for your whole province, and then a certain amount of money has to be given now to education. And then it's decided how that then schools will receive the money, as I'll explain further. So you find out that education will receive about 48% of the whole budget that is distributed to provinces. And then you will have within the province then your quintile 1 to 3 schools, and your quintile 4 to 5. Now, what is interesting is that Eastern Cape has 70% of its schools under quintile 1 to 3 schools. And Gauteng, interestingly, has over 54% of its schools under quintile 4 to 5 schools. What that means is that 70% of schools in the Eastern Cape are solely dependent on government because they're a no-fee school. And then over 54% of schools in Gauteng are fee-paying schools. So they're running their own schools based on their own financial muscle. And these Gauteng schools are still having access to businesses funding their schools because either the parent would have helped in doing the administration. For example, I work for a company. So if my child goes to a certain school here, I'm able to talk to my manager to say, part of your corporate social investment, please consider my child's school. And then in that, they're still receiving extra funding. And also, what happens is government will decide that this year will give per learner 1,500 rand in no-fee schools. And that 1,500 rand is for the whole year. But on the other side, former model C school will say per learner per month is paying 1,500. Now, the difference is that this side of the coin, they're doubling that money 11 times in a year. And that gives them closer to 15,000 per learner. And you know that school fees are decided per grade. It's not a one-size-fits-all. But when it comes to no-fee school, it's a one-size-fits-all. A grade 10 learner, a grade 12 learner, a grade 8 learner, they're receiving the same amount of money. And when that money comes, it's not coming to the coffers of the school. When it comes to quintile 1 to 3 school, it's kept under the district department. And then the district department will then administer the funds. So a school, which is then, those are Section 20 schools. That's where the Section 20 comes in. That Section 20 schools do not administer their funds. Yes, they have the funds under their name of the school, but they don't administer the funds. So they'll make a request to the district department to say, we need books, we need repayment on this, we need bills for sport and all of those things. And then the district will then procure the textbooks and everything. And when they procure that, those things, they use the tendering system. And we know how problematic the tendering system has been in South Africa. So you find out that now books will not be delivered on time because the contractor has not procured all the books to deliver them on time. You would remember the case that happened in Limpopo, I think around 2015, 2016, where books were not delivered on time. Because that's what happens, that the contractor does not deliver on time. At the same time, you find out that, yes, there will be a procurement, the school will go and do a request, there will be a procurement of the books, but the books will never arrive at school. This is one of some of the things that were highlighted when I was doing my research, doing a questionnaire in schools, that one school in the Eastern Cape, they did the request, the procurement was done, but the books were never delivered. However, when they were receiving inventory for the things they've received in the school, it was there, it was paid for, which also amounts to maladministration. And even when that money comes to schools, there's already a decision that for repayment, it's 12%. For textbook, which is learning and teaching material, it's 60%, it's 65%. And I just forgot the third element. I don't want to go through my whole research because it will take time. But that's how it comes that when they receive those instructions, or when they receive their money, there's already an instruction. So even if they want to prioritize buying textbooks, they cannot prioritize buying textbooks because there's already a category of saying on textbook you can only spend so much. As a result, you find out that then the textbook will not be enough for that school. But then on the other side of the spectrum, Quintile 4 to 5 school, and some schools in Quintile 3, they apply to be a Section 21 school. Now, a Section 21 school, it means it administers their own funds. When the government decides that this school is getting 20,000, that 20,000 is deposited directly to the school account. Then they decide how to administer the funds. They have a bit of autonomy, or a lot of autonomy on the funds. And also at the same time, they speak directly to the suppliers, which allows them to negotiate for fair prices, and the books will be delivered on time. But on the other side, what I also didn't mention was that what happens is when suppliers deal with departments or the government, they inflate the prices of the textbooks. So a school would receive lesser textbooks as compared to a school that is in Section 21, which is some in Quintile 3 and all the schools in Quintile 4 to 5, because they directly deal with the supplier and they negotiate their own the amount of money they can buy the books in, and then that allows them to have more books. And even in terms of preparing the schools, that allows them. And also what is advantageous about Section 21 school, they decide also on the extramural activities, because they have more funds, they can have many other programs, which would have been an assumption that we had, that our schools are no-fee schools and government will provide everything. But if you look at what is happening, when you look at fee-paying schools, they have more extramural activities. And when you look at no-fee-paying schools, there's only maybe netball or the rugby and soccer and a bit of music, and it ends there. Because of this, again, of those two differences that have happening. I mean, that is what happens on the equitable share when it's happening. But there's a second part that is used by government to fund school through conditional grants. Now, conditional grants are mainly for Quintile 1, 2, and 3 school, your Section 20 schools, whereby they are for infrastructure, nutrition, teacher development. But now, the challenge with the conditional grants is how they're administered. So the South African system operates on corporate governance, which is Department A has no say on what Department B does. Now, when the national government sends money to provincial government, when they give them money, the national government no longer have much say on what happens at a provincial level. And what that does, when department in the provincial level, maybe they have been investing 150 million for infrastructure development, and they have not been meeting their targets. And now then the national department decides to give them a conditional grant of 50 million. Now, that conditional grant has to be solely used for that specific sector, which is infrastructure. But what they can do is to now change their share when it comes to that 150 million they will have, which is their equitable share, and decide to now invest 100 million in the infrastructure and take the 50 million they were given by government to make the 150 million and redirect the other 50 million they had. Because on the 150 million, the national government has no say much of what the province does and how it allocates it when it comes to infrastructure development and other things, but they do have a say on the conditional grants. So the province can still be in the very same place it was in at the beginning, because instead of having 200 million, it still has 100 million, 150 million, because there was a redirect from their equitable share and took the 50 million for conditional grant and augmented it to be the same 150 million. So that is the challenge of what happens into conditional grants. But also the other challenge with conditional grants, because they mainly deal with infrastructure development. Provinces have came, mostly rural provinces have came and said, okay, we've finished the money, but the target has not been met. Because at times you find out that a school will be built and they'll find out amidst the project that the contractor that was appointed is not legally allowed to build the school. Or the contractor has ate the money. So they ran out of money and they have to allocate another money to a different contractor. So the mismanagement and the structure of conditional grants then become very flawed because it does not reach its purpose. And then that then affects infrastructure development. And it takes years for things to be done. You'll find out that most schools in the rural areas are still using latrine toilets. As a result, in 2015, there was a learner who died at school in Bizana. He or she was 5, I think. And then that was just after another learner in Limpopo, a grade R learner, had also fallen in a pit latrine. So parents are sending their kids to school only for them to die. But at the same time, it is teachers that are supposed to make sure that these kids are safe. Beyond them teaching in class, they have to make sure that these kids are safe because their school infrastructure is very poor. Just December last year, Equal Education was celebrating that a school in Mthatha, just when you go to on your side, Esmangweni, they were celebrating that after 4 years of taking the government to court and everything, they're finally building a proper toilet. So they had those kids, after many years of not having toilets, even when the government was taken to court, they still had to wait 4 more years before there was a proper toilet. And that's 27 years post-democracy in South Africa. And if you go to Gauteng, I went to one of the schools, Benoni High. When I entered, the way the school is so properly managed and in every other way proper, it was even more than what some of our campuses, our university campuses are. It was so beautiful. It was so well managed. So well done in terms of the infrastructure. So you then have these two: the administration being not properly well in your rural school, and then you have your funding that is not firstly administered properly, and even when it's administered properly, it's just not enough. And these two are supposed to hold the system together. Also, one thing to also highlight, in 2016, the Eastern Cape Department returned 560 million to the national government. That was money that was unspent, and that money was allocated for infrastructure development. And then the next coming year, they came and said certain schools had not been built. And that money, when it came, it was reallocated to Limpopo, Gauteng, I just forgot the third province. So then you also have an understanding issue because of administration issues, again, maladministration. And then that questions on the personnel that we have in our departments, from department to the school. Watching the time, the next question is, how does this two, the lack of administration and the insufficient funds and the maladministration, even on this insufficient fund, does to the education sector as a whole? It then affects the teacher provision. Some of you might have parents who are teachers who've been crying of the redeployment. They're being redeployed because while the PEM document, which is what is used for administration and the conduct of teachers and many other departments when it regards employees, and it stipulates that in class there should be, maybe in music class, there should be at least about 35 learners. And then the minimum being 40, that's universal. In most of the time, that's the universal number. And then in that aspect, you then have your rural school that has 80 learners. So it means for music, they're supposed to be having 2 teachers. But they cannot have that because government is using learner enrollment as a cost driver to allocate teachers. They're not allocating teachers based on what the PEM document stipulates, but they're using a different setup whereby they're counting the number of learners. And if, for example, a school has 500 learners, and in terms of the PEM document, those 500 learners would have translated to having 25 teachers. Because they're mitigating cost as the government, then they will have 15 teachers. And that presents a whole other spectrum of challenges. One, classes are overcrowded. A class that is supposed to have 40 kids has now 80 kids. So a teacher has to teach an overcrowded class. Number 2, the teacher has to now, instead of teaching the number that she was supposed to teach, maybe 120 kids, let's say we're taking English, and that teacher was supposed to teach maybe 3 classes, and that being 40. That would have been 120 kids. But now, that teacher will teach 3 different classes. There's your grade 10A, grade 10B, grade 10C. Let's say hypothetically all have about 50 plus learners. And then that teacher will then have to take care of these learners and make sure that he or she gives attention to those learners. It's impossible for one person. And it's impossible because a language in terms of English has 3 papers. So let's say hypothetically there's 50 learners in one class. That teacher will have to mark 150 scripts by the end of the term. And by the end of the year, on the 4 terms, there's to continuously mark 150 scriptures. And then you multiply those 50 learners, or you rather say 3 classes have 50 learners, and the teacher has to teach those 3 classes altogether. So the teacher is having 150 learners, and you say 150 learners, their scriptures times 3, that's 150. And then that will be different based on the school. I know one school, Lihana in Mount Fletcher, in our class in grade 11, when it came to business studies, there was 70 of us. When we were in class, there was a bit less, but then the Lesotho class had more learners because it was a Lesotho-dominated area. So those are the dynamics that teachers have to face in those conditions. But if you look at now quintile 4 to 5 schools, you then have this school strictly saying we're having 40 learners in our class. And even on that, if they are receiving 15 teachers from government, based on the fees they're paying, then they'll say, as the SGB, under the SGB fund, we'll then acquire 5 more teachers. And you'll find that these teachers will be paid the same amount or almost close to the same amount that is paid to the rest of other teachers who are under government. But if you look at the other side of SGB and your quintile 1 to 3, quintile 1, 3, 2, and 3, they cannot be able to raise such funds. As a result, SGB teachers are underpaid in those schools because either the kids are in child-headed homes or the kids, the parents are not working or they're living with their grandparents. So to ask them to contribute 50 rand, you are saying they must not have bread for the next 5 days. So they constantly have to mitigate between or choose between buying bread or contributing to the school. But still, 50 rand is not going to do anything because remember, those schools are receiving per learner 1,500, but the quintile 4 to 5 schools are receiving per learner 1,500 times 11. And that's not even the money they're receiving from government, because last year, the quintile 4 to 5 schools were receiving a subsidy of 300 rand per learner. So on top of what they already have, and in terms of school fees, they're receiving a subsidy from government of per learner of 300 rand. So they use that money into what one of the participants called to enrich the experience of the learner, because they already have money in their coffers and they already have a proper building that just needs maintenance. And they already have many other things that they don't need to build from scratch. So theirs is to maintain the structure, it's to pay the municipal bills, and it's to make sure that their learners are receiving good education. So that affects a lot of learners based just on those differences. But when you're coming down, the teacher training becomes an issue also, even within the training, because you find out that most of our workforce that is well educated is migrating to urban areas. And you then find out that rural provinces are having less and less of people who want to go there. For many other reasons. One, there's bad roads. Two, the teacher will be staying in Solo and teaching in some rural areas that is almost 40 kilometers away. So they have to constantly commute because there are no, there are no boarding schools to allow the teachers to stay. And there are no renting places because it's a rural community. But if they migrate to an urban area, they're able to rent and they're highly closer to their school. And that then it decreases the expense of commuting. And also at the same time, the geographical location where they are, even in terms of access to training, a teacher that is teaching in Bizana has to travel for about 400 kilometers to East London when there's a training for a new program. But a teacher in Gauteng will probably commute for about 30 kilometers at most. So most schools in Gauteng are within the 50-kilometer radius, even to their national, even to the provincial department and national department. But for Eastern Cape schools, they are at a 400-kilometer radius. And sometimes they have to constantly go in between provinces. And even within the district, you find out that some schools are in a over 100-kilometer radius. And it is the school that needs to, the teachers that need to commute in between submitting school plans and many other things. So these differences then translate to what we have. So where you study and where you live has a lot of impact. Again, even within the distribution of funds by government, they do not look at the location of the school. So a learner that is in an urban area that is already having access to certain resources is receiving 1.5 in a northern school, and is receiving the same 1.5 that is received by a learner in a rural community in the Eastern Cape. Even when it comes to even with learners, a history learner is still receiving the same amount as a physics learner who needs a practical. As a result, part of the questionnaire was to question in terms of whether school have a library or a laboratory. And most of the rural schools had no laboratory. And even when they had some of the equipment to use in class, which is not even safe because they're using it in their own class, they were not being supplied with the chemicals and many other things of fun. But on the contrary, on a school that was in Port Elizabeth, they had 7 science laboratories, they had 6 computer laboratories, and they had 1 function library. And this is a quintile 4 to 5 school. A quintile 1 to 2 to 3 school has no laboratory, has no library. Something so essential as a library to have information, it's a luxury to a learner in a rural school. And also there's no provision of librarians. So if there's a library, the teacher still has to be the librarian, has to do the job in a quintile 1 to 3 school. But in a quintile 4 to 5 school, there is a librarian dedicated for that. At the same time, when it comes to the administration of the school, you find out that in quintile 4 to 5 schools, there's more than 2 secretaries. There's a secretary for the principal, there's a secretary for the school, and there's a secretary for a different department. But when you look at a different part of the spectrum when it comes to rural schools, you find out that the principal has to be the administrator. Yes, I've noted you, I'm just finishing up now. The principal has to be administrator of the school, and in some of the rural schools, there's not even a deputy principal. So the principal is in class at the same time, the deputy principal, so the principal has to do some of the administration with the assistance of the other teachers. So the teachers are then overloaded and they're unable to carry their duties as compared to the teachers in urban areas. So those are the differences and the disparities that translate into the current results that we have, because 2 learners learning in one system that is called a uniform system, they're experiencing the system altogether differently. So I'll give to Ntokozo for any engagements, and then at the end, I'll just give out the recommendation I had given in terms of my research work as to what I do recommend could be used, which was translated from what the participant has had suggested to move the system forward.
Thank you, Isa. Just to remind you, my name is Nkubeko.
Sorry,
let's
so
start
much.
with
this much
we do have. I understand.
Yeah,
we do have a question and
okay.
many comments that are uploading or maybe commending the research topic. They're saying it's a very informative, interesting.
So, sorry, because of
no,
members
I can just read them to you. Most of them are saying it's an interesting research topic. Most of them are saying it's an interesting research topic, and some of them are saying it's educational. So yeah, Putsabelo, Ntanjana, I think on this teacher shortage factor that affects our educational system. He's asking if would you suggest would you support the suggestion of having assistant teachers like it's done in other countries then the teacher focuses on the curriculum, while the assistant takes care of the other aspects. Would you support that?
Most definitely, I would support the teacher assistants, because one, I'd imagine that a teacher assistant has to at least have some level of understanding of teaching and learning, because I think it will be detrimental if they don't have that understanding. Therefore, if they have that understanding, it then allows teachers to have someone to help with marking. It allows the teacher to have someone to help when they are planning for the class in terms of material and many other administrative issues. And then the teacher will solely focus on delivering in class. Because again, one thing that I couldn't highlight was that rural schools, when it comes to textbooks, they have a limitation. So teachers still need to write notes at the board in order for them to give notes to the learners, because there's shortage of books. And at the same time, learners have to share books. And it means if I have the book and you don't have a book, I can prepare for class, you cannot prepare for class. So then it means we're still going to depend on the teacher to write the notes. So in all of those issues, I think a teacher assistant is needed. But also at the same time, in terms of shortage, it's also caused by many other issues whereby teachers get into the system. You would know that there's PGCE now. People who don't find jobs, they'll translate and they'll do 1 year and get into teaching. And as soon as they get their dream job, they move out of the system. So instead of, for me, I'm personally not for that, for the PGCE certificate. People who do education, it must be so strict to get into education as if you're getting into medicine, so that as the country, we get the cream of the crop that is going to teach the kids. Because education, when you get to university, it's one of those degrees with the lowest points, and anyone can just enter. So education is not taken serious in that point of view, because if I don't qualify for the accounting degree I wanted to do, I can simply go to education. When it should be the other way around. It should be more difficult to get into education than it is to get into accounting. To ensure that whatever teacher we have, the criteria of choosing teachers is
the 12 teachers.
That whoever chooses teaching, they know they'll sweat to be there, and they know it's not teaching is more than a job, it's a calling. And we need to make sure the people who are in that department, they are called to be in that department. At the current moment, we're not having that, we're having the other way around. People are using teaching, some of them, it might be a small percentage, but it still has an impact. They're using teaching as a way to get a job, and as soon as they get their dream job, they move out of the system, which cripples an already limping system.
If I'd agree with you, I think we'd get on to another topic, which I feel like it's a topic for another day. The PGCE and education qualifications issue is a topic on its own. It's a topic on its own. But I'm very much interested in Isa. Is there no policy or something that stipulates this learner and teacher allocations? Maybe in a class where there's 30 learners, there should be a teacher for 30 learners in Denjalo. Is there no policy that that stipulates those allocations? And if there is, how is it monitored? Or why is it not monitored? Or why is it not done kanjalo? So there is a policy. Situation of having.
If you read your PAM document, which is the personnel administrative measures, I think it's around page 80 or so. When you're going down into you'll see then that for music class, you're supposed to have, for one teacher, you're supposed to have 35 children, including 35 learners in class. There is a policy in place. However, because government is mitigating the cost of providing teachers, because it's solely on them, they then allocate teachers based on learner enrollment. So not in terms, so they're not looking in terms as to how many learners are per class. They're looking at how many learners are at that school, and allocate teachers. As a result, just something else I didn't highlight, that leads to what they call multi-grade teaching, whereby a teacher who was supposed to teach history alone, history maybe, and because there are shortage of teachers, will have to teach life orientation or creative arts or technology. Those are the most affected 3 subjects. As a result, you will see that people have been complaining that there's no use of having LO, because people who are teaching LO are not trying to teach LO at times. And the reason for why they end up teaching LO, because there's no teacher to teach LO. And then they do what they're calling multi-grading. And then the teacher then again gets more work, they're overloaded, and then they have to teach different classes and they can't give attention to kids in class. As a result, a lot of kids who have potential are lost through the system because a teacher cannot simply focus on this one learner. They have to look at the rest of the other learners. And it means they're just doing their job. And in most of times, we've seen this when we're still in primary or even in high school, by teachers will choose the kids who are excellent in class and take that for moderation. And once they take that for moderation, it's done. And then the rest of the learners who need more attention, they're not getting that attention. So it's a battle now of minds, or rather a battle of survival of the fittest. If you're not well acquainted with a lot of things, or if you're not as strong academically, then you have a problem. Because again, with school, they only focus on theory. Whereas in Quantum 4 to 5 school, they have theory and practical. So you learn something in physics, you go and do your practical. With us, it remains in theory. So even a learner would have excelled when they see practical, they never get to that stage because the resources are simply not there.
Speaking of the quantiles that you touched on, is there even a possibility of having a sort of educational balance between this section 20? You said the quarter 1 to 3 are section 20 schools. Is there even a possibility of having a balance between these quartile schools, the quarter 1 to 3 and the quarter 4 to 5? Maybe in the near future, is it even possible to get to a point where we are on an equilibrium point?
So one of my recommendations was to use what the Chinese use and in terms of funding. That's the first part, an express guarantee system, whereby China has 3 regions. It is the East, West, and Coastal region. The Eastern region is the rich part of the country, which is, you would then in South Africa say it's your Gauteng, it's your Western Cape, and it's your Free State. To a certain point to Free State. And then that region, the Eastern region, which is the economic hub of the country, they're not receiving any financial assistance from the government in terms of funding education. Education is solely dependent on the provincial department and the local departments, which is they generate most of their revenue through taxes and businesses in their area. And then your Western region and your coastal, and your Western region is your Eastern Cape, Limpopo, and KwaZulu-Natal, because it's the rural part. And for that one, government, the central government of China, which is the national government, is more involved financially and providing every other resource, because those parts of the country, they don't have more people, and there's no tax base, or there's very minimal tax base, and people are unemployed, so they are unable to contribute to the economy of that part. So the central government, to try and balance, they then try and provide for that one. Then you have your coastal region, which is the middle part, which is, it will be your Northern Cape and other parts whereby they're not necessarily well off, but at the same time, they're not that poor. So they are the middle ground of what we have. Then the government then has the central government, I think it provides about 30% to 50%, and then the rest is catered for by the local government, the local sphere. But it needs more research on how that would translate into South Africa with the current economic sphere. And then the second recommendation was that in terms of the school-based management, the government need to relook the system. And in terms of school governing bodies, the person who's running for a treasurer must at least have an NQF level 4 qualification to run as a treasurer, and make sure that person is able to understand policies, to draft at least a budget, to at least not necessarily do a clean audit, but able to check, okay, we've spent so much money and this is what we're supposed to buy. Just the basic of audit that you do even in your own groceries. And alternatively, take back the power to the principal. The principal must be the administrators and the accounting officers of the school in order to be able to hold them accountable of the finances in the school. Because currently we've had many cases, we've had a couple of cases whereby that go to court, whereby there's been a decision that is made by the SGB and there's been maladministration. And the parents are saying, we didn't understand what the principal was saying. And the principal is saying, I don't have the decision power, the parents have the decision power. Then who do you then hold accountable in that instance that the parents made a decision without being well vested, and the principal who had manipulated the process, or rather taken advantage, because at times in some researches it showed that principal holds information just to sabotage the SGB because they don't have the power, and they sometimes don't give information so that they can still always have a upper power into the school. So principal must take the power, and yes, there must be an SGB to hold them accountable, but at the same time there has to be a radical process of teaching parents, not just the 10 SGB members, but parents as a whole, about the school system. And it needs to be translated in the schools, it needs to be translated into our own vernacular so that they can be able to read them on their own, or even their kids. But also to highlight, there's a lack of involvement by learners into the SGB, mostly in Kwanja 1 to 3 school, simply because of our African socialization. Kids don't engage with parents. And it's different when it comes to other countries, and even the more affluent the community, the more learners will engage. I was looking at Sweden, learners have class council, high school learners have conference. It's mandatory for the system to run, and they have to decide on the everyday life of their schooling. And the last suggestion I had was the twinning system. So there's a popular system that is coming up now, whereby an affluent university adopts, in a lack of a better word, adopts a more or less affluent university. So for example, VET will say, I'm taking Forte as part of a partnership, whereby they share most of their resources. This now has been done in Jiangsu province in China. And again, it will also need more research because South Africa is more rural, and we need to then make it balanced, whereby a high school, let's say a Benoni High School in Gauteng, adopts a school in Nduli and say, we are taking you as part of our franchisee, as a franchise, in a franchise and franchisor situation of saying, we are taking you under us. We will provide resources that we're no longer using. We'll share with them with you. We'll also share our administration strategies. We'll share how we run a school and all of those things. So that also assists the government in this process, because this does not only rely on government, but the larger community. So a formal system of training two schools, a more affluent school and a less affluent school, and make sure that there is a helping of balancing the system. But also, the participant had suggested an alternative system altogether of funding, one that is influenced by vertical equity, which means the funding is based on the needs. So the more affluent the school with the express guarantee system, the government gives that solely to the district to take care of, and then the whole other schools are taken care of by the government, the central system funding.
It is indeed a very interesting.
Yeah,
very interesting research topic. Seems like the more questions asked, the more insight we get.
Yeah.
Last question before I ask you another last question. Despite the challenges, because we're running out of time, despite the challenges, how far are we as the country from having a better educational system? Are we getting there, or we're too far, or we are not even moving? As per your knowledge.
I must say, firstly, that despite the shortfalls we have in terms of the equitable share and everything, the government has done and tried to strive for a better education system. As a country, we've managed to implement the universal declaration of universal primary education. So in terms of quantity, we're there. We've mastered the quantity part. Where we are lacking is the quality part. As a result of that, you find out that schools in rural settings, again, are the most affected, where you find out that teachers are focusing more on grade 12. They'll learners will get to school at 7 and leave at 8 and at 6 in the evening. They'll have extra classes and everything in between. Because what creates that is that they didn't have foundation in primary. They cannot read, they cannot write, they're finding it hard to comprehend even the content. So when they get to grade 12, teachers are playing a catch-up game. So we need to relook our education in terms of foundation. Where we're lacking the most is foundation.
From the foundation.
They cannot be able to read, they cannot be able to write, they cannot be able to comprehend until late in their lives in high school, and they have to comprehend it because there's no other choice but to pass beyond. So what teachers then do, they invest all their time to make sure that these kids pass grade 12, which is one of the participants said, we want to make sure that they are in the same level as the models in school, but that is done at the compromise of other learners in grade 10 and grade 11, because all the focus is in grade 12 because they're supposed to go out of the system.
And I think that's true because Nyani, especially in the Eastern Cape, when you look deep into it, the problem most of the time is just the comprehension. People, it's not that they don't know or they have less knowledge, they just don't know what is being asked from them, what's required of them. I think that's what lacks from big foundation. Okay, Isa, just before we wrap up, just before we close, this is a page for young people, dominated by young people and for the young people. We like to inspire, we like to motivate, we like to encourage each other. Having you being a master's student from China, what would you like to say, or what are your words of encouragement or guidance, since you said you have a guiding thingy going on for people who'd like to go and study abroad? What would you say, or what would you advise to people like that?
Okay. For that one, there was on the last part of sorry?
It's Nkubeko.
Why am I missing your name? Where's my mic? Sorry. Sorry, Nkubeko, for the last time. I'm sorry. On that part, on the last part, may I please just say, I will give to Gogo the document I have created as a guideline on how to apply for international scholarships. So there's a full document I have created that is a guideline. It's not a official document of the government. It's a personal journey of mine and the things I've learned on my process to applying for international scholarships, because I went through my journey for 4 years. So I made sure that I write everything that is needed, that I think is essential and basic in terms of finding an international scholarship and what to decide. But what I want to say to young people watching from South Africa, there's a greater need for us to tap into the research area. I know it's a very popular belief that we need to go get our degrees, then work. But so long as we're not part and parcel of knowledge production in terms of research papers, in terms of books, we'll continue having our kids having content that is international. Because currently in South Africa, especially in primary education, the books that are used are produced internationally, but they are talking about South Africa, because there's a whole lot of dynamics that can be discussed as to what leads to that. But as young people, we need to get into the space of research. We need to pursue our masters. We need to pursue our PhD. I know there's a whole topic of education is just a paper now, and education is this and that. To me, we continuously celebrating people ascending to power as administrators, as deans into universities. It's well good and it's great. But to have a dean in a university that is procuring books that are written by international scholars does not make much of a difference, because everything of what we need is our kids consuming content that is about our country. And decolonization needs us to tap into that space as scholars, and that means we need to pursue our masters, our PhD, fellowship to be professors. Because just lastly, the Department of Education has decided to phase out life orientation and have history as compulsory. The question is, whose history and who's writing that history? Those are the questions we need to constantly ask ourselves as to, on the books provided, who's writing the book? And they're writing that book from what lens? Because it's well and good to have a book that is based from South Africa, but we know we find books that are written by other people besides Black people problematic into providing a clear history of our country and our people. So it means us as young people, we need to do research, we need to write the books, but in order for us to write the books, we need to do the research. And it means beyond just having and celebrating that we're having the first dean in this department, we must have more of our people saying that we're having more of our people and our students producing books that will then translate into being into shelves and being sold into government. And at the same time, we need to collaborate amongst ourselves as young scholars to write these books again and make sure that they're produced and they are there for our kids to consume. Otherwise, all that we're doing will continue just talking. If we're not part of knowledge production, we're playing with fire, because knowledge is power. But whoever writes your knowledge determines what you consume.
In simple terms, people need to hear our side of the story. People need to hear about South Africa from our lens, not from their lens, and not knowing the deeper or the real things going on down here. Okay, thank you so much, Isa. We appreciate people like you in this group, or in this page, or in this platform, because we learn every day. We learn every day. There's, I'm sure that there's 1 or 2 or even 50 people who have learned a thing or two from you today. And more than anything, we just like the fact that we are seeing our one of our own, or our members from church growing in all spheres of life, not just spiritually. So that you go into platforms where you can bring about change. I know you are also okay, I do not want to bring that, yeah, but please go, unite, inspire, love, and develop more people than us. And that you offered to us and the effort you put into the presentation. There's no better way of saying thank you.
Thank you.
There's no better way of saying thank you. Could we just close our eyes, I almost said ears, our eyes, sibulele uThixo, then we can close. Father, we thank you so much. We thank you, Lord Almighty. We thank you, Ngo Isa. We thank you for the opportunities that omnike zona okanye umvulele zona, so that she can explore whatever that she's explored, and for her to attain whatever knowledge and qualifications that she has now. Thixo siyakucenga ke Moya Oyingcwele ngenxa yakhe, umvulele ingcango, umvulele amanye amathuba ukuze Thixo namandla onke whatever that she has akwazi ukuvulela nabanye bawona amandla onke, ukuze Nkosi namandla onke izwe lethu Thixo namandla onke liphakanyiselwe kwenye level. Moya Oyingcwele sithi singalindelanga bawona amandla onke abantu basuka kwezinye indawo ukuze basenze sibe ngcono. Thixo namandla onke siyakubulela bawona amandla onke ngokubona ukuba uyakwazi nathi ukusisebenzisa. Lord Almighty, we are not useless. Thixo namandla onke, we are useful, and there's something about us, each and every one of us. May everything that was being shared here, Thixo namandla incedise here and there nakubantwana bakho. Siyakubulela ke Nkosi nangelithuba, siyakubulela nangezi zi-resources osipha zona, siyakubulela nangale platform ye-Wesley Guild SA, because iyabanceda abantu ngegama likaYesu Kristu. Amen. And now may the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the sweet fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us now and forevermore. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Isa.
Thank you. Huh?
Still live. We are still live.
Okay.